Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 16 of Mr. Mackenzie's Distance Learning. World War II, Victory in the Pacific. Let's begin now. So we're going to start today's talk with Pearl Harbor, yes, again. Let's quickly talk about what was happening just before Pearl Harbor. At this point, basically the Japanese and the United States are trying to freeze each other out economically. But ambassadors on both sides are negotiating. Okay, they are having some talks. Now, what do they want from the U.S.? What do these Japanese ambassadors want from the U.S.? And what does the U.S. want from them? Well, basically, we want to see the Japanese want the U.S. to stop aiding and helping the Chinese. And the U.S. says they'll stop when Japan gets out of China. And neither side seem to budge on this issue. Now, it's worth noting that back in the 1920s, the United States had figured out how to read Japanese encryption, basically being able to read their secrets. So this is going to help them learn their secrets. The U.S. will get wind that Japan will stop negotiating in November of 1941. And they're pretty sure an attack is going to happen. An attack is going to come from the Japanese, but basically they don't know when and where it's going to strike. Maybe it'll happen in the Philippines or somewhere else in the Pacific. Now, Japan is not really keen on fighting both the British and the U.S. at the same time. Both the British and the Americans are major players in the Pacific, but Japan is not really ready and willing to fight both of them at the same time. So an attack on America or American interests in the Pacific is imminent, but the U.S. is not really sure when or where this attack is going to strike. Now, what is Japan really hoping for with the attack on Pearl Harbor? What are they hoping for? Well, they're hoping to deal a crippling blow to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. And they would hope that the United States, after this surprise attack, would negotiate a surrender and be forced to open up trade again. Because remember, the Americans had freezed all Japanese assets and cut off trade and placed embargoes. The Japanese are hoping that once the U.S. kind of surrenders, asks for a peace, that trade would once again open up again. Trade that Japan desperately needs for its war machine. And with the United States out, Japan could then focus on Britain again. This is a satellite image of Pearl Harbor. I don't know how many of you have actually been to Hawaii or seen the memorial site at Pearl Harbor, but this is a satellite image to give us a good visual of what the harbor looked like. Now, you may be surprised. Maybe you thought it was just more open, kind of a bigger bay area, but it's worth noting at that little tiny, narrow passageway that takes you into the harbor. So obviously the Japanese have some goals for their surprise attack. They want to cripple the U.S. fleet, hurt them militarily, and they also want to cut off that passageway, that narrow entranceway into the harbor. So on the day of the attack, one of their goals is to bomb that narrow passageway so no ships could get out of the harbor, making anything that wasn't already sunk, it would just be kind of a sitting duck and rendered useless. But what we're going to see is that from this attack, yes, they do sink many battleships, but luckily enough, all of the U.S. aircraft carriers were out at sea during this attack and not in the harbor. And the Japanese were also not successful in closing off that narrow passageway. It's going to be worth noting that the aircraft carrier really saves the day for the U.S. Pacific Fleet in World War II. So, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy like we've all heard. Japan at the same time also attacks Hong Kong, which is a colony of Britain at this time, Singapore, Malaya, the Philippines, and Midway Island. So, what is the impact of the surprise attack of Pearl Harbor? Well, it does cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Many battleships were lost, but they did not, luckily enough, they did not lose any aircraft carriers. They were all out at sea that day. They also did not close off the harbor, like I said on the previous slide. And ultimately what happens is it forces the Americans to enter officially in the war. The Japanese hope was that they would get a quick surrender by the U.S., and that ultimately doesn't happen. The very next day, the U.S. declares war on Japan, and Britain also declares war on Japan as well. Now, we also see that tripartite pact coming into play as well, as Germany and Italy will also declare war on the United States after this. In early 1942, the U.S. engages in two major naval battles in the Pacific. The first one we're going to talk about is the Battle of the Coral Sea. Then we'll talk about the Battle of Midway. So May of 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea occurs. The Coral Sea is just north of Australia, and this is really to stop the Japanese expansion into Australia. And this is the first naval battle in military history where the ships never saw each other. This was an aircraft carrier battle. Planes from the US and Japanese carriers met in the skies above. The era of the battleship was really World War I, different from World War II, where it's going to be the era of the aircraft carrier. This is a victory for the U.S. as they sink two Japanese carriers while they only really lose one. Now, this is losing two aircraft carriers is fairly devastating to the Japanese because they're not able to produce as much as the U.S. And overall, throughout the war, the U.S. will be able to outproduce the Japanese and make and build more and more aircraft carriers. Losing one or two aircraft carriers for the Japanese is much more devastating than the U.S. losing one or two. The second major battle that we're going to look at is the Battle of Midway. Now, in this battle, we really see cryptography coming into play, and the United States being able to read Japanese telegrams and coding. They were able to tell that the Japanese were planning an attack of Midway Island. Okay, they understood that the main Japanese fleet was heading towards Midway. So cryptography really plays a major role in why the U.S. were victorious in the Battle of Midway. Now, Midway is often referred to as the turning point in the war in the Pacific, the same way that Stalingrad is a turning point in the war in Europe. Kind of after Stalingrad, everything turned sour for Germany at this point. Midway is kind of the same thing in the Pacific. Everything's going to turn in favor for the U.S. after their victory here. The Japanese will lose 4 carriers. Basically 50% of their fleet they lose in this battle. That's devastating. The U.S. will lose 1. Now, once again, the U.S., The U.S. can outproduce the Japanese. Okay, the Japanese definitely cannot keep up with production like America can. So losing basically 50% of their fleet at the Battle of Midway is a devastating blow. The U.S. at this point has now stopped Japanese expansion in Asia and can head towards the Japanese mainland in what we're going to call a island hopping campaign. Here we see a little caption for the photograph in the background. Smoke billows from the carrier USS Yorktown before it sank during the Battle of Midway in June 1942. During the battle, which lasted from June 3rd to 7th, 1942, Japan lost nearly 300 planes, a cruiser, and 4 aircraft carriers, which had been among the 6 used in the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor a half year earlier. So the U.S. will now engage in an island hopping campaign. Now, this is obviously a different strategy than what we're seeing in Europe at this time, with the Allies trying to get back into Europe and kind of surround Germany. We see the Allies in North Africa and then into Italy. We see the Soviet Union fighting Germany in the east. We see the Allies preparing for an invasion of northern France. So it's kind of being swarmed all around Germany, and then kind of getting closer and closer and pushing from all different directions. But now in the Pacific, it seems like the U.S. Pacific Fleet is really just hopping from one island to the next, getting closer and closer to mainland Japan. Now, each one of these kind of island hopping battles has to consist of an amphibious assault. And there's going to be two battles of importance that I'd like to discuss. The first one is the Battle of Iwo Jima and the Battle of Okinawa. Now, if you recognize that picture, that memorial, that statue there of the 4 U.S. Marines hoisting up the American flag, that is from Iwo Jima. This is the Iwo Jima Memorial that's found in Arlington Cemetery in Washington, D.C. This is my photo from 2004, and that's me standing in front of it. So you can get a pretty good idea of how big this memorial is. So obviously this is a very iconic image of the U.S. victory in the Pacific, and particularly the victory on the island of Iwo Jima. If we see this map of the Pacific here, we kind of see that kind of island hopping strategy. We see the kind of green arrows showing the Allied advance and kind of the explosions of where major battles are taking place. On the far right, you can see where Pearl Harbor is, and then just to the northwest where Midway Island is. Now, Iwo Jima and Okinawa are actually fairly small and aren't even registered on this map, but they're closer to mainland Japan, just kind of a little bit south. I'll have a better map of that on the next slide. So if we look at this map, we see Iwo Jima kind of has been blown up there from that little red square, and to the left of that, the island of Okinawa. Now, at this point, the U.S. is really learning and understanding the enemy here. With each battle they fight, it is just ridiculously fierce between the Japanese and the United States. And really, they're understanding that their enemy will never surrender. Even if they are overwhelmingly defeated, they are not surrendering. They also faced kamikaze pilots on the open seas. So the U.S. was facing an enemy that would rather kill themselves than take out others than surrender. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa occur in 1945 and are both victories for the U.S. After this, after these victories, and you can see how close they are to mainland Japan, they can now start to bomb mainland Japan. In March 9th, 1945, the U.S. launches an air raid on Tokyo. This is going to be called Operation Meeting House. And here we see the U.S. Air Force using incendiary bombing on Tokyo. Now, incendiary bombs are really meant to ignite things on fire. The Allies don't really use these type of bombs in Europe because most of their buildings are made of brick. But in Japan, most of the houses are made of wood, and incendiary bombings are just going to light them up on fire. The U.S. would kill an estimated 80,000 Japanese civilians in these night raids. It's worth noting that the attack on Pearl Harbor cost about 3,000 American lives. So the U.S. does this not only to the city of Tokyo, but dozens of other cities at this time. Japan has been defeated on the seas, and now they've been defeated in the air. The United States at this point have air superiority around Japan. The U.S. is looking to bomb Japan into submission, but as they've seen time and time again, the Japanese are unwilling and will never surrender. In April of 1945, FDR dies. His vice president, Harry Truman, takes over. And it's really at this point that he learns of the U.S. nuclear program, which was called the Manhattan Project, where scientists for the past 4 years have been developing an atomic bomb. In July of 1945, Truman is at the Potsdam Conference. This is in Germany, where he will learn that the U.S. has successfully tested an A-bomb in New Mexico. Again, you can see how our grand alliance here of Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, again, the U.S. is that buffer. Where FDR was always seen in between Churchill and Stalin, now Harry Truman has taken his place here. And a big decision is now on Truman's shoulders because they have the technology. They've successfully launched and ignited an atomic bomb. Now, what can Truman do with this technology? So a heavy decision is now on his shoulders. So Truman has this heavy decision to make now. What are his options? Well, his first option is that he could invade Japan. The military at this point was working on war plans for an amphibious assault on mainland Japan. This was known as Operation Downfall. This would basically be Normandy on steroids. Troops would have to succeed at an amphibious landing and fight the Japanese troops as well as civilians who have pledged loyalty to the emperor. This could cost 200,000 U.S. soldiers. And that's very tough for a president who, once again, is in power through democratic election. How is he going to tell the American people that he sent their husbands and sons on this amphibious assault on mainland Japan when he could have just dropped a bomb and saved all those American lives? He has to be thinking about that as well. Another option is to negotiate with Japan. The U.S. is already burning city after city to the ground. the United States is really only going to accept unconditional surrender. Another option is that they could wait. By July of 1945, the Soviet Union is just about ready to attack Japanese holdings in Asia. The Soviets are coming, and this could convince Japan to surrender. But if the Soviets come in, they may never leave. Okay, so why is that bad? Okay, the Soviets might help, but this could be bad. Why? Because when the Soviets come in, they may never leave. And just like what we've seen in Eastern Europe, what Soviets sweep past, they keep. And it'll be kind of gobbled up behind another kind of iron curtain of communism. And that's not what the Americans want. Another option is to do a test run, put on a show in Tokyo Bay, a big exhibit of the power and might of this atomic weaponry. Show the world what they have. And of course, another option is to use the bomb on a civilian population of military importance and end the war swiftly. Ultimately, this is the option that Harry Truman will take: to use the bomb on a civilian population of military importance, hopefully to get an unconditional surrender. So, at the Potsdam Conference in Germany, he gives Japan a final warning. Japan must surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. And Japan does not surrender. Then, on August 6, 1945, the U.S. drops an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima, the first ever in human history on a civilian population, Hiroshima. 70,000 Japanese are killed instantly. Now, why choose Hiroshima? Why does the U.S. choose Hiroshima? Well, first, it was an important military industrial site. Truman insisted that wherever the bomb was to be dropped, it had to be of military value. Hiroshima had also not been previously bombed by the incendiary bombs. Now, even though 70,000 Japanese die instantly, the Japanese do not surrender. 3 days later, on August 9th, 1945, the U.S. dropped another bomb on the city of Nagasaki. 40,000 Japanese are killed instantly. Within the next week, Japan will surrender unconditionally for the first time in its history. These are images of the aftermath of the bombing of Nagasaki. So hot and intense was the explosion of the bomb that people's shadows of where they were at that moment were imprinted on sidewalks and the sides of buildings, like a flash from a photo, kind of in a very kind of morbid way, sealing their image there forever. So, why did the U.S. win in the Pacific? Well, they gained air superiority. Air raids crippled Japanese production. The very fact that the United States are going to be able to keep producing and producing is going to be a very major reason for their victory in the Pacific. The fact that the Japanese are cut off because they're an island nation, they've been placed in embargoes, and they're kind of hurt with their war machine, they cannot produce as much as the Americans. The United States is safe from invasion. There's two oceans on either side of them. There's the Atlantic that separates them from the war in Europe, and there's the Pacific that separates them from Japan. So they're safe from this invasion and free to produce a lot of weaponry. The island hopping campaign worked, was very successful in getting closer and closer to mainland Japan and stopping that Japanese expansion in the Pacific. Incendiary bombs worked. Okay, crippled Japanese city, city after city after city. Most of their buildings and homes were made of wood, and these incendiary bombs just lit them up. So basically, one of the biggest reasons as well is that the US was able to outproduce the enemy. Japan just couldn't keep up with production. If you look at this chart showing merchant ship production in tons, it shows us the US versus Japan by year from the beginning of the war. And the first two was basically before the US is even at war. By 1941, or really into 1942, when the U.S. is declared war, their production skyrockets, and in Japan, it does slowly. I mean, they just can't keep up. They're still kind of increasing production, but not nearly close to the rate that the Americans are. So, for all those reasons, is really plays a major role in why the U.S. is victorious in the Pacific. And then in September of 1945, on the Japanese eventually sign unconditional surrender to the Americans, ending World War II, and America and the rest of the world can begin life again. This is where we are going to stop. Hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.